Okay, we'll make a start. I'm Tim Johnson. I'm director at AEF. Just a few housekeeping points up front. Firstly, we are recording this webinar. I hope that's okay with all of you. Um, Many people want to hear the webinar, can't attend at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. So that we've said that we'll make a recording and make that available afterwards. It also means that you will get a link and you'll be able to watch again if you haven't been able to take notes or listen again to the bits that interest you. A couple of thanks up front. Firstly, to Florence, who will be running the webinar. So anything administrative, letting people in, muting, overseeing the questions. Florence is the person for this call, and a big thank you to her for arranging it all, sending out the invites, and getting everyone together this morning. The other person I'll introduce in a minute, but Celeste, our policy manager, she'll be co-presenting with me. Couple of things to say. Entirely up to you whether you want to stay on video through the call. We're happy if you do or you don't, but please do stay muted if you're not speaking. If you have any questions, there's no need to keep them until the Q&A. Just type them into the chat. We may not take them until later, but at least we've got them and we can start to group them and think about how to respond. If you do ask a question, either in the chat or verbally, then please say who you are. And if you represent anyone, please do that too. Okay, so I'm going to dive straight into the presentation. This is a actually no, I've done the housekeeping. I'll just finish up the agenda. We're going to do a presentation on the Heathrow expansion national policy statement. That will be a sort of double header. So myself and Celeste Hicks, our policy manager. We aim to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we hope the main benefit of this webinar is that you get to ask your questions and we can provide you with answers. So we'll finish with plenty of time for Q&A. So without wasting any more time, let me dive into the presentation. First of all, I think what is the Heathrow expansion national policy statement? I know many of you will be very familiar with it and its contents, others less so. So hopefully we pitch this at a level that gives you all something to think about. But if it covers some sort of fairly obvious points for some of you, please excuse us, but we're just trying to bring everyone up to speed. But the draft Heathrow expansion national policy statement effectively updates the 2017 Airports National Policy Statement, which you'll recall provided parliamentary support for a third runway at Heathrow. The interesting difference this time round is, yes, it continues to propose support for a full-length runway, but it opens up the possibility that that runway could be delivered in phases. So it may not be a 3,500-meter runway to start with. It could be something smaller, akin to the proposal that was put forward by Aurora. And the draft NPS is open to that, providing there is an allowance to go to a full-length runway at some point in the future. And I think the other thing that's worth saying here is that this does not shortcut the approval process. Even if this goes through and Parliament chooses to adopt it later this year, we still require the applicant, and that applicant could be Heathrow Airport, but it could be Aurora. But it requires the applicant to submit a formal proposal for a development consent order, a DCO. So that is still required. So this, if you like, is phase one. It doesn't begin and end this year. What the national policy statement really tries to do is to set out the terms and conditions on which a third runway could be deemed to be acceptable. And so you still have to then go through the actual application phase to see if the applicant has met those tests and delivered on what government wants to do. So it's part of a longer journey, but a very important step and something that we want to make sure we get right at this stage. Probably worth saying that alongside the draft Heathrow Expansion National Policy Statement, the government also published a raft of supporting material. There's an appraisal of sustainability, which in itself is divided into sort of biodiversity and noise and other sort of environmental issues. So there's a report on each of those that sit underneath the appraisal of sustainability. There's a habitats regulation assessment, an equality impact assessment, a health impact analysis, and there are updated costs and benefits appraisals also there. And importantly, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, there are new UK passenger and CO2 forecasts. Now that's significant because the last time we had official documentation on updated passenger forecasts was back in 2017, and a lot's happened since then. COVID and the recovery from that, as well as things like Jet Zero and the UK legislating for net zero. So these are long overdue. We don't normally have a gap of 9 years between iterations of the forecasts. But I think in total, I think we added it up, and there's over 1,000 pages to read and digest this summer, and plenty of data sets to that underpin that. So the reason we're holding this webinar today is because of this timetable on this slide. We have a public consultation on the draft Heathrow expansion NPS. It runs for 10 weeks. It was launched in June, so that actually closes on the 1st of September. With the upcoming holiday period, that's a real challenge to go through those 1,000 pages in detail and to be able to respond. And say this webinar is to A, encourage you to make a response, but B, to help you think about what the content of that response should look like. Running in parallel is the Transport Select Committee. They have been invited to scrutinise the draft NPS. We believe that a space on the Transport Select Committee may be given to the Environmental Audit Committee. The Environmental Audit Committee held its own airports inquiry last year and invited Ruth Cadbury to sit on that committee on behalf of the Transport Select Committee. So this might be an opportunity for EAC to also get involved. But primarily, this is an inquiry that will be led by the Transport Select Committee. You will note that the call for evidence closes this week. It closes on Thursday. But if you want to also respond to that parliamentary process, we do encourage you to put something in. The Secretary of State also wrote to the Climate Change Committee, inviting them to submit their views on the proposed expansion. CCC initially declined the request to do that in advance of the public consultation. They were very sensitive that they didn't want to be accused of working with government on this, and they were very clear that they would respond, but only after government published a draft that was in the public domain and that everyone could see. As a result of that, CCC's own timetable means that they cannot provide that advice by the end of the consultation period for the public. And they're currently aiming to publish somewhere between the 9th and the 16th of September. And they've written to the Secretary of State to set out that timetable. Likely their advice will be in two parts. One commenting directly on the draft, and the other more substantial part would be providing an update on aviation's sort of decarbonisation progress more generally. And then what happens after that? Well, government has to reflect on what comes back from the public consultation, the any recommendations from the Transport Select Committee, and indeed the CCC's advice. It may propose amendments to the draft MPS, but its hope is that that parliamentary scrutiny and a vote to adopt the revised draft could be possible by the end of this year. Just in terms of AEF activities, and I would stress we're part of a much broader coalition. This is not just AEF, but many organisations working in a sort of coordinated and way to sort of get our points across. But certainly from so we are part of that overall effort. But at AEF at the moment, we are concentrating on our response to the Transport Select Committee this week. Um, we'll then obviously be responding to the public consultation, and we are going to provide guidance to members. So some of that's already out. If you look at our website and you look at our sort of material on the news page around the four tests, there is a sort of an early indication of our thinking and where we think the flaws are and the gaps are, and that's something that we'll be expanding on very, very shortly in this. We've maintained a close dialogue with the Climate Change Committee throughout. We hosted a meeting for some NGOs and CCC back in May. We'll certainly be active around the party conferences this year. It seems a good and timely opportunity to engage and talk to MPs ahead of the vote later this year, as a possibility of us working with other NGOs to actually have a stall in the exhibition centre. We'll continue to have meetings with DFT. We're sort of working through a number of technical issues that we have with some of the material that they have provided the public with, just to inform our understanding around the forecast, the assumptions made, and what goes into that. As you'll hear a little bit later, there's a lot of information, but there's a lot of information still that's not presented. And without it, it's quite hard to interpret all of the data and the figures that we've been presented with. We'll have a more general outreach to MPs, and we'll be coordinating, as I said at the beginning of this slide, with the local groups and with the national environmental NGOs on this issue throughout. And I think, we feel that united front's going to be a really strong incentive, I think, for government to think about the issues that we feel are really important and need to be highlighted. So I'm going to pause there. I'm just going to introduce Celeste Hicks, our policy manager, because there's one other change in this MPS from the one we had in 2018, and that is the critical national growth infrastructure designation. So, Celeste, do you want to talk to this point?
Hi, yes, hello everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your interest. Yeah, so we're basically going to divide this into just talking about what we think is this CNGI designation. And then after that, we're going to go to talk roughly what we're calling the four tests, which is Labour's four tests, and how we think that those meet the threshold. And that kind of underpins this argument for CNGI, to understand the relationship between the impacts and what the CNGI would do. So yeah, in the draft Heathrow Expansion National Policy Statement, they introduce a concept known as CNGI, which, as far as we're aware at this point, hasn't been mentioned anywhere else and has not been used before. So it sounds like a completely new designation as far as we can understand. So I think what it means and how it's applied are up for interpretation. So AEF is working with a couple of other organisations to try to just get as much information as we can about this, because on the face of it, it sounds like quite a worrying development, because it sounds like the sort of thing that, if it goes through in its entirety in the draft HENPS when it's sorry, I'm calling it the HENPS because it's easier to say than Heathrow Expansion National Policy Statement. If that goes through in the parliamentary vote, it looks like the kind of designation that would mean that even if the environmental impacts from the scheme are huge, and they will continue even after the mitigations have been put in place, it will give the government, at the point where they make the DCO, the planning application decision, it will give them the right to presume in favour of the development, even if the mitigations put in place are not sufficient to get rid of all the residual impact. Which, to put that simply, gives them essentially what we think would be something like a get out of jail free card. So as far as we understand the process at this point, it would be that the 4 tests, which we'll go on to in a minute. So Labour's always said that the airport would not be allowed to expand without meeting these 4 environmental tests. If the scheme promoter comes along and says, right, well, this is what I'll do to reduce air pollution, this is what I'll do to reduce CO2, this is what I'll do to promote economic growth around the country, and this is what I'll do to reduce noise impacts. If the government at that point assesses, okay, well, they've done as much as they possibly can, but there's still some impact because this scheme is so huge, we think that the CNGI designation could technically mean at that point they say, well, great, they've done everything they can possibly do. We can't ask them to do anything more. We're going to go ahead even though there will be residual impacts. So we're trying to just understand that. But I think I just wanted to we had a discussion about whether to put this first, but I think that we decided we think it could possibly be something that would just trump everything that we're trying to work on reducing impacts. And so we needed to just draw people's attention to it. So the work that I mentioned before, we're working with some other NGOs and some legal experts to try to understand what it means, and also to look at what justifications the government might need to show that this thing is, and I think the key word here is growth, critical national growth in infrastructure. And you'll see when we talk about economic growth, we personally at AEF do not think there's been any proof that this will lead to growth that could possibly justify something so draconian as just allowing them to go ahead even when the impacts will be still there. So just to sort of raise people's awareness on that. So now I think we'll move on to talk about the 4 tests. Sorry, Tim's controlling the slides. Right, so this is not in any particular order, but we'll talk about climate impacts first. So I don't want to dwell too much on what we think the climate impacts will be, because a lot of the information about the climate impacts is in the aviation forecasts, which Tim is going to talk to you after we've finished talking through the 4 tests. So yeah, Labour said before the government, but Labour before they were the government, but in government, have also said that the climate test would basically be that the project should not jeopardise our ability to meet our legally binding climate targets. So obviously that's a quite difficult question to answer, because just for the sake of people who don't necessarily understand how the carbon budgets work, the carbon budgets allow you to emit a certain amount of carbon in any one period, and it's for the government to decide how that carbon gets apportioned between all the different sectors in the economy. So it doesn't mean that you can't do a project because it's going to increase carbon emissions. It just means that at the national level, the government has to decide, this is the project that we're going to give the budget to. So it's almost like a household budget. We're going to spend our money on pizza, but we're not going to spend it on potatoes. It's that kind of difference. So the figures look huge, so 41 megatons per year by 2050, but it's basically how that relates to the years of the carbon budget that we really need to think about. And this is the question that's had us scratching our heads, and we're still not completely sure what the answer is. But basically what we want to know really is how much additional CO2 will be produced by the third runway, and how does that relate to each of the years of the carbon budget up to 2050? Because of course in 2050 the carbon budgets end, because at that point we're assuming that we'll be at net zero. So it's actually fiendishly difficult to answer this, because what we don't have is a figure of what the emissions would be in 2050 without a third runway, because the government's forecasts basically just show assume that all of the airport expansions which are in the pipeline will have happened by then, and we end up with this figure of 41 megatons per year, which, by the way, is twice the level that the Climate Change Committee said should be for its balanced pathway. I think they said it was 21 megatons per year, so it's more than double of that, almost double, sorry. Yeah, so it's difficult to measure that in the years of Carbon Budget 6, which is basically 2033 to 2037. We're anticipating the Heathrow runway would open in 2035. So we've really just been trying to understand what happens in 2035 when the runway opens. And the question is even more complicated because of what Tim mentioned before in terms of the staged development. So it's not assumed that the airport opens in 2035 and then literally all of the extra flights arrive that year. What happens is over the course of the next 15, 20, up to 2095, in fact, they look at the aviation forecasts, look to see which aircraft come to Heathrow, which relocate away from Heathrow, what new routes open, at what point does the longer runway in the stage development open, then what does that do? So it's quite difficult. It's very difficult to actually know what the answer is to whether it will affect the carbon budgets or not. But we at the moment, we're working on an assumption that it's about 3 megatons per year by 2050. So Tim will talk a little bit later on about what we think will happen with aviation emissions over that period and whether that is a significant number and whether there's any chance that it could be bigger or smaller by the time that we get to 2050. So anyway, I'll move on to talk about the air pollution impact, but we can get into the very complicated climate questions later if people have any questions. So air pollution impacts, again, the government's test on air pollution was that it would not compromise, the expansion would not compromise our legal responsibilities on air pollution. So it's a similar test to the climate test, is that basically we will have the legal limits, and this development has to show that it won't breach those legal limits on nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter 2.5. So that's the very, very small particulate matter. So far, so good. The problem is that the targets that they're using, or the limit values that they're called, is basically according to the 2010 legal limits on NO2, so nitrogen dioxide, and PM 2.5. It's now known within the scientific community that those limits are too high and that there are still very significant impacts on people's health at those limits. But the UK legal landscape hasn't caught up with that yet. So what we've got is a test that says we won't breach the legal limits, but we know that the legal limits will lead to people having health impacts. And the NGO community had asked for the test to be that this is assessed against what's known as the WHO, the World Health Organization, has health-based targets which show what they believe to be the level for nitrogen dioxide and PM 2.5, which won't affect people's health, or the least impacts on people's health that you can get. And those targets are basically a quarter of the UK's legal targets now. And just for comparison, the EU is on a pathway to half the UK's legal limits by 2030. So we're really worried that this development, if it's assessed on the old legal targets, which basically need to change because they're not protecting people's health, we will have a situation where the UK is exposed to twice as much pollution as other European communities, and particularly those around airports. We're worried that that means that all the dirty planes which can't land in Europe will come and land in Heathrow, and all the impacts that that's going to have on the health of communities around the airport. And by the way, all of the monitors currently around the airport would fail the WHO test, and more than half of them would fail the EU interim targets. So, it's already a problem, and that's without expansion. We're also concerned that there wasn't really a proper mention of ultrafine particles, so UFPs. They're a little bit of an unknown, or not unknown, but there's been less research on the impacts of those, but they're very specifically linked to aviation because they come from kerosene, and kerosene has not been hydrotreated to remove some of the small particles, which have, by the way, been removed from road transport fuels. So this is a very particular aviation problem. There's no need for the airport or the scheme promoter to show that they will mitigate ultrafine particles. Not the only, but one of the big things in the HENPS, which basically aims to control pollution around the airport, is increasing the mode share target. So mode share means the proportion of people who travel by public transport. It's currently something around 46%, I think, of people go to the airport on public transport. The mode share targets will increase to 50% in the first stage of the expansion. And then at the second stage of the expansion, they need to increase to 55%. So that's great, because that's going to put an obligation on the airport scheme promoters to show that they will try to do things to persuade people not to drive to the airport. The problem is it allows quite a significant increase of 30 million passengers before those targets are kind of assessed to see whether they're working. And the other thing that we have a big problem with is that a lot of that's to do with rail connectivity, and there's no obligation on the scheme promoter to show at the DCO stage that the rail connectivity is actually going to happen. That won't be assessed as part of the DCO. So we've got a big problem with that as well. So that's air pollution impacts. Maybe move on to the economic impacts. So this one is, we're quite surprised that the lightness of the test in the Heathrow expansion national policy statement, given that this was the only justification really given for the project, was that it would boost growth. It's quite a light test, so we're drawing attention to that in our consultation responses and what we're putting into Transport Select Committee. They have improved the way that they do the economic impacts of the scheme. There's a lot more in it than in the previous ANPS. But unfortunately for them, the figures have got even worse, much worse than they were for the ANPS. So those of you who were around in 2018 will remember that eventually the net present value of the scheme fell to around somewhere between 2 billion and minus 3 billion over 60 years, which really was quite a shock to people that it was that low. This time round, because they factored in the carbon costs of the project properly and some of the environmental costs, it falls to somewhere between 28 billion, minus 28 billion and minus 62 billion. So that's not necessarily the cost as such, it's the social cost, the welfare cost of the project. But it shows quite seriously that the government, even the government's own analysis, knows that the environmental costs of this are so huge that they far outweigh any of the other welfare costs that could be generated by doing the third runway. And I think another thing that bothered me personally was that this is really just an analysis. So any of the benefits that are captured are just the benefits for the passengers and the consumers. So the benefits are things like more flights at more convenient times, fewer delays, and then some idea that Heathrow will reduce the cost of landing at Heathrow and it will promote competition, and that will be good for consumers, which is basically passengers, and doesn't take any consideration whatsoever of the 70% of people who don't fly through Heathrow Airport and more than 40% of people who don't fly at all in any given year. So this is really the only benefit they list is to consumers and passengers, which I think is problematic. And then just, the GDP figures that they put forward as well are really very small. So when Rachel Reeves resurrected this scheme in early 2025, she said it would lead to 0.5% economic growth. And then when the HENPS came out with the government's analysis of it, using, by the way, Frontier Economics, which is the company which Heathrow has used to do some of its economic analysis, Frontier Economy somehow ended up with a tenth of that figure. So it's only 0.05% impact on GDP, which is about a billion, somewhere between 1 billion and 2 billion. And that will not be fully realised until 2056. So 20 years after the runway opens before we see a 0.05% impact on growth. So just keep that number in your head, because we think that's really key to challenging the critical national growth infrastructure point that I said earlier. How can this be critical to growth if it's only going to generate 0.05% by 2056? And just on the economic regional impacts, again, the frontier analysis, which we looked at, shows that all of that growth accrues to London. It's something like 0.17% growth in London, and it's almost nothing in all of the regions outside of London, maximum 0.03% growth. So it does not pass that test according to AEF's initial analysis. So I'll hand over to Tim now for the noise impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Celeste. Just a few more slides so we hold true to our aim to give you plenty of time for questions. But obviously, we can't talk about Heathrow without talking about the noise impacts. It's the reason why many of you will are members of AEF and support us. So we should say up front that we don't have any new information in the NPS or the supporting material about likely actual flight paths. I think the government's still hiding a little bit behind the fact that there's an airport modernisation process that is ongoing, and that will provide the answers in due course, but not in time for this consultation. And so they've fallen back to using the information that was provided by the Airports Commission almost a decade ago, albeit information that the Airports Commission did seek from Heathrow Airport. But, arguably, we are having a consultation about noise and a potential scale of noise across London based on largely theoretical flight paths that may or may not be the flight paths that materialize if the airport opens a third runway in a decade's time. And that just sort of feels fundamentally wrong. We understand like the challenges of the process, but people are being asked what they think of the proposal today, and yet they won't really know how it impacts them and what the flight paths will be for another decade. And yet their moment to have a say has been and gone. So I think that's in our minds is worth keeping sort of front and center whenever we talk about noise. That like the people who will be impacted and not being presented with actual information that the airport will be held to. That said, the assessments of noise that have been done to date for the NPS assume that there will be a 6.5 hour night flight ban as per the recommendation from the Airports Commission last time round. And they do assume that there'll be a system of runway alternation. Now, obviously, that system of runway alternation will look somewhat different if you have 3 runways instead of 2. But I think the likelihood is only 2 would be in use at any one time. But I think further details on how alternation would run, periods of respites, how often people could expect that's something that we certainly need more clarity on. According to existing government noise thresholds, so they tend to look at noise above 51 LEQ as being the sort of, the onset of sort of community annoyance. Using that existing threshold, then if you look at the noise impact with a third runway, it will be 50% larger than under a continuation of the 2 runway scenario in the future, albeit that with time and the introduction of less noisy aircraft, they believe by around sort of 2055, it will be smaller than it is today, about 10% smaller than it is today. And you get a similar situation looking at night. So again, the sort of the threshold here for sort of community reaction is sort of set at 45 LEQ for night, and that contour will be 41% larger than it is with a 2 runway scenario, but again, just marginally quieter than it was in 2024. But there's a big but that comes with this, and most of you will be really aware that last month the government also published the long-awaited results of its ANAS and ANI studies. So ANAS was a large scale, statistically relevant, large scale sort of survey of people's reaction to aircraft noise conducted around 10 airports in the UK, obviously including Heathrow. Annie was a similar study that looked at night noise specifically. But the results of ANAS, I don't think it was surprised communities, but it certainly surprised CAA and government. The results of ANAS are really striking. So the point at which 10% of the population is highly annoyed by aircraft noise has dropped to 43 LEQ. Now that's a staggering reduction when you think that a change of 3 decibels represents a doubling or halving of noise energy. To get from 51 down to 43, you can understand on that sort of logarithmic basis the scale of change that's taken place in the UK. And I think government's scratching its head and trying to understand why that's the case. Is this a reaction having experienced COVID and less traffic? People are more sensitized. Are we as a nation just cross about everything? These are things they're trying to work out. But they may have published the study last month, but they had the study since way back in the end of last year. And because of that, they didn't base the current assessment of Heathrow on this new data, but they have actually provided a sensitivity test. And there's a little bit of a tantalizing statement in the NPS that says the government aviation noise policy has yet to be reviewed in light of the newly published evidence, suggests that they will review it. Obviously, we hope they do that really soon. I think it's critical, not just for Heathrow, but for the airspace change as well. But they did provide the sensitivities. And the sensitivity tests, which are buried in the appraisal of sustainability in an annex that deals with noise, reveal the extent. So if you apply the new sensitivities at 43 LEQ, it shows that nearly 3.5 million people, predominantly in London, but let's not forget the populations going out towards Reading in Berkshire, but nearly 3.5 million people will be in a noise console where at least 10% of the population are highly annoyed. And that's something like 1.5 million households. It's 33% more than would be the case with 2 runways. Again, it's slightly less than it is today. We've changed the metric here. But today would be about 4.6 million people if we use this lower threshold. But I think something that is, I think, very statistically valid, is a very material impact. It changes the cost basis. If you look at the costs of mitigation and the costs of the project in terms of people's sort of well-being and the impacts on health, we certainly are highlighting that it should be based on this new lower number, which is the result of the government's own evidence. Right, one wrap-up slide, and then it's definitely question time. So some of this we've covered, but we didn't want to close without saying something about the 2026 air passenger and CO2 forecasts. I mentioned these are the first ones since 2017. Some very welcome changes that we have seen in this modelling compared to the modelling that was done in 2022 for Jet Zero. Our criticisms of Jet Zero was that it assumed a theoretical carbon price, which the aviation industry wasn't actually paying. So it over-promised emission reductions that weren't going to be delivered in reality. It sort of made very bold claims. We used to call it techno-optimism around what aircraft of the future may do in terms of efficiency improvements, and indeed what sustainable aviation fuels may contribute in the future. We spent a long time critiquing that. We commissioned our own research from some of the government's consultants to sort of critique it as well. And like a number of other NGOs and you as local groups, I think that message has got through. So we're really pleased that the assumptions that underpin these forecasts have actually applied new assumptions that actually sort of bear more a closer relationship to what's actually happening. So they now think staff won't be 50% in 2050, it's probably more likely to be 30. The efficiency improvements have been scaled back, and the carbon prices reflect what's actually being paid in the emissions trading system and under ICAO's Corsia offsetting scheme. If you reduce all those things, it's no surprise that carbon goes up. And as Celeste mentioned, it means that in the continuation of current trend scenario, and that factors in everything that the government is currently doing, the SAF mandate, and some of the other jet zero initiatives. If you continue doing that, carbon now will reach 41 million tons in 2050. And under a more ambitious technology development scenario where you have additional mitigation, it's still 28 million tons. Now, in Jet Zero, just 4 years ago, we were saying aviation emissions with Heathrow expansion were going to go down to 19 million tons. So we're a long way short of being able to achieve that. And so, regardless of Heathrow expansion, there's a big question for government about aviation decarbonisation, whether it's on track, how we can actually close that gap, and can we actually add to the problems that are there with a Heathrow third runway. If you want to know the Heathrow forecast specifically, they go from 17.46 million tons in 2024 in the forecasts up to 18.43 million tons in 2050. And they're over 20 million tons in 2060. And I think this is a really critical point, and Celeste alluded to this. The big difference between these forecasts and the 2017 forecasts is the speed at which traffic builds up at Heathrow Airport. So in 2017, they assumed a third runway, but they assumed that it would be full within 3 or 4 years of opening, and therefore the noise and carbon impacts and air pollution impacts were felt, within the 2030s. Now they're assuming there's a really modest increase that actually will take place between now and 2060. So Heathrow does not become full in this model until 2060. So most of the impacts associated with the higher levels of traffic all happen in the late 2040s or after 2050. So things like net zero, we're looking at it in a snapshot, but we're not necessarily looking at the worst case. So I think I've covered all the points, but yeah, our runway 3 is included in the forecast baseline. All other approved capacity increases at other airports, so Gatwick and Luton, are also included in the baseline. Some numbers that you may want to know if you don't already, but the capacity for Heathrow with a third runway is assumed to be 130 million passengers a year, with air traffic movements rising to about 750,000. And then all of this contributes to an increase in passenger growth in the UK system, 491 million by 2050. And that compares with around 292 million passengers in 2024. So that's a 70% increase over today's levels by 2050. And similarly, air traffic movements grow from around 2 million in the UK in 2024 to 2.8 million. So a more modest increase of about 40%. But obviously that tells you if your passengers going up by 70, but your plane numbers are only going up by 40, there is a big shift to larger aircraft, which in themselves means potentially, more noise and more emissions to lift those larger aircraft. And I'm going to pause there. Sorry for the lengthy run through, but it is time for you to ask your questions. I'm going to cancel the presentation so we can all see each other. As we said at the outset, either raise your hand if you want to pose a question. Ideally, please type it in the chat because then we can group them and take questions together. But do introduce yourselves and do say who you are. Okay, I'm going to stop it and hand over to you.
Yeah, so we have a question that came in early in the chat from Peter Willen from the Richmond Heathrow campaign talking about they're hence estimating no increase in ticket prices as a result of this expansion and therefore no reduction in demand. Can you, either Celeste or Tim talk about the demand forecasts that were made available by the government and also what estimates were given to any increase in ticket prices, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I can have a go. I must say the forecast is something that we're still working our way through. We've asked for a meeting with DFT with their modelling team to take us through it. They are they're complicated to answer the question. I mean, they try and estimate future changes in GDP and oil prices, how the carbon price may change. And then they also look specifically at sort of demand at Heathrow. But at the moment, that question is subject to a separate, we haven't discussed this, a separate CAA consultation about how the developers of this scheme can potentially reclaim their costs. So, as you'll probably be aware, Heathrow Airport, if it is the person that submits or the body that submits the DCO, they can actually reclaim a lot of their costs in advance through existing landing charges. Whereas a body like Aurora, if Aurora submits the DCO, it doesn't operate the airport now. It's got no way of offsetting its upfront costs against the existing passenger charges. So the CAA is actually looking at the funding models, and there's three or four options on the table to see if there's a bit more of an even playing field, and that will affect the price that passengers pay. But one of the key arguments that we are making, led by the New Economics Foundation, is that in almost every project, it is clear that it is the cost basis should be the project itself, not the airport as a whole. So can you actually reclaim your project costs just from the third runway? And that's the way other infrastructure would deal with this problem. If you did, it's just economically unviable. You wouldn't go ahead with this project. But the fact that you can sort of at the moment spread your cross across the whole airport and make existing users also pay for the third runway, that's something that the current rules permit. But I think it needs to be really teased out, and government needs to make it clear when they say this runway has to be cost effective, they mean it has to be cost effective in its own right as a third runway and not as an airport as a whole.
Great. We also have a question from David Nichols that talks about how best for individuals to respond to this consultation. What do you think is the best strategy? Would it be to use similar points, or sorry, I'm just rereading the question, or to use sort of AEF's response to create their own argument, or maybe rely on their own individual knowledge and experience? So I guess just the general question would be, how do you think individuals should respond in the most effective way?
Somewhere between the two, David, I think. Our objective, I think, is to provide everyone with four or five key points under each of those topics. So covering all the major issues. And individual respondents could then either pick the issues that matter to them most, or they could cover all of them if they wished. They could supplement that with their own local experiences. And I think that's something that perhaps AEF can't do as a national body. We perhaps lack the ability to supplement this with own local experiences. So certainly add those things in. And I think, that richness I think you get from people adding some of their own content is really to be encouraged. But we'd certainly help to steer people and make sure that there is a consistency in the argument by providing the sort of core arguments that we see under each of the points. And if you agree with them, and you may not, and you may want to say something else or add to it, but if you do agree with them, then yes, please use them.
Yeah, and we have another question from the chat, and then I'll go to Armel. Thomas, I do see the hand up. Do we have any insight into Andy Burnham's position on the Heathrow project, or is it too early to say where he's
I
going
think
for?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's a good question. One we're asking ourselves. I mean, Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, was always critical that this may be another example of infrastructure in London that draws growth away from the regions and negatively impacts on other regional airports. But Andy Burnham, the Prime Minister, may have to take a different national perspective. And we see this all the time with constituent MPs who understand the noise issues, for example, and then become aviation minister and realise they have to strike a balance. So we're trying to work out what that balance could be, but we certainly think the experiences that Andy Burnham had as mayor would make him receptive to the arguments that Celeste was highlighting, that there is very little regional benefit to Heathrow expansion. And so, it is possible, but I don't know what the chances are. I wouldn't put any odds on it, but it is possible that we could see either a change in position or perhaps more likely just not making this a priority. And one thing that Rachel Reeves wanted to achieve was speed, haste. And so maybe it would not have the same level of government urgency and perhaps sort of the process becomes much more elongated and dragged out.
Okay, great, thanks. And Armel, if you could unmute and ask your question. I am a bit aware of time as well, so I do want to get to as many questions as possible. So if you could say your point succinctly, that would be really good. Thank you.
Well, sorry, Celeste. Thank you, and thank you, Tim. But I mean, this is supposed to be about questions, and we've had 50 minutes without any questions. My name is Armel Thomas. I live in the compulsory purchase zone, which is the third runway. I represent the 5 Heathrow villages that could be bulldozed either at the beginning or at the end. So first of all, it is totally unacceptable to the residents to actually have a half runway. We've gone to the Aurora meeting and they've suggested that as well. We have been under blight since 2001. We've had enough. Either we are all bulldozed or we are all staying together. It is totally unacceptable. So I hope that people listening to this will actually mention that. We are not prepared. I mean, I will be gone, but, I will have thousands of residents who will be going on for years and years and years. And that is totally unacceptable. Secondly, the 6.5 night flight ban does not exist. They stop at 11:30 and they start at 4, quite often, even an early Hong Kong. So that is not true. Second, the contour may be smaller, which is Heathrow saying that. But because Heathrow has actually damaged the Heathrow villages so much, we have now homes where there was one person and they've been turned into HMOs where you've got 6. So there are 4 houses that I know of in Harmondsworth, which belong to one person, where now there are 24 people who don't know each other. So that is, the contour may be smaller, but the number of people is much larger. Relocation hasn't been mentioned. Where are the people going to go? You can move a family on its own. You can't move 6 people in one house. That hasn't been mentioned. Also the safety aspect is not mentioned by anybody. Now, we haven't got the Air India full context yet, but, we have been very lucky at Heathrow that we've only had 2 crashes, serious crashes, but actually adding the number of flights at Heathrow with the third runway, you are actually asking for trouble. We already know that the go-around are now much larger at Heathrow. They are going to Hayes, which they didn't do together before. We also know from Longford that they are already using their runway, which they are not supposed to do because the Section 106 has not been agreed. And the last things I want to say, Tim, you said you are coordinating with the local groups, but neither the residents association in Harmondsworth, Longford, or Simpson have actually been contacted. So how do you intend to do that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Great points. I'll deal with them all in order very briefly. Yeah, please, you sort of highlighted the large scale demolition, and I suppose that's something that doesn't come across through the NPS in any sort of, it's not at the forefront of the document, and that has to be highlighted. The 6.5 hours, I think in fairness, the draft NPS doesn't say that that does exist. It says they've modelled it as if it will exist because it was an Airports Commission recommendation. So the modelling of the future assumes that would be a 6.5 hour respite period. But, you know, that's been left up to the CAA to determine. I think there's certainly lots of questions about, well, when does that start? When does that end? Is the respite period the same on all runways? Is it an airport respite period or just a runway respite period? So I think there are good questions around that. So certainly worth on the scrutiny. Demolition, you mentioned, but the relocation point as a consequence. That's not easy. I've got a local development that's involved 4 or 5 houses being demolished and 10 to 15 people being relocated, and that's dragged on for like 18 months. It's not easy to do, and maybe the political challenge of that, as well as the logistics, are certainly underplayed. Yeah, so I mean, part of the engagement with all our members, including the groups you represent. I mean, it starts with today's webinar. We are in a process where we're gathering the information. All of this only came out 3 or 4 weeks ago. We're gathering all the information ourselves. The first point was to go through it, present to you our major findings. But as we move forward through the summer with all those opportunities that I highlighted and then the political scrutiny in the autumn, that's where we want to make sure that the local groups have their voice alongside us. There are some parliamentary events being planned in September for when we get back, and certainly the local groups should be part of that, will be part of that, to tell your story.
Great. And Stephen, I think we have time for your question. Thank you for waiting. If you could unmute and let us know your question.
Okay, thank you very much, and congratulations on a very, very useful session. There's a different area I want to sort of highlight really, which is around the economics and how this affects Heathrow, the internal economics to Heathrow, and the sort of money they're talking about investing could be 49 billion. I mean, in total, I know that it could be phasing, but there's also the surface access. So this is going to be a huge project to fund. So any assumptions about the slow build-up of traffic movement goes against essentially Heathrow's ability to fund this project. So I think those traffic build-up assumptions are unrealistic, the pass-through and non-pass-through scenarios. And there'll be an imperative on Heathrow to use the runway once it's there in order to get the money back on their investment. So as far as I know, none of this has been addressed yet. It hasn't been agreed between the CAA or the DFT or Heathrow. So I think there's a massive funding issue around this, which will conflict with the evidence-based assessment. And that if you could find a government, once it sort of puts its back behind this, if it does, getting sucked into a situation where it has to help Heathrow out, because the funding issues have not been considered, the effect of RAB and the effect on passenger fees. Heathrow will need to get its money out and quickly because its internal rate of returns that affect the project financing in this situation.
Thanks, Stephen. I mean, I know all excellent points. I mean, I think that fundamental tension between the convenience of having slow passenger growth so that your environmental impacts in the 2030s and 2040s don't look significant, but then make your point that if that's the case, there's not an economic return that's viable for the airport. That's an inconsistency I think we could certainly build on. Your other points, yeah, in the interest of time, we'll note them. We'll come back to you on them. But thank you for making them. I think they're all adding to the, if you like, the richness of arguments against it. I think we're on time, Florence, and I know there are other questions. As Celeste and others have said, if for some reason we haven't been able to answer them fully, and I appreciate there's lots around noise and about will aircraft become quieter in the future as they claim, we could actually add that to the sort of pack that goes out after this as follow-up. So we'll deal with all the outstanding questions and provide answers. If that's the case, I'm keen to finish on time. So this is just, to Amel's point, this is just the first of our webinars. We'll keep them going throughout the year, provide you with regular updates. We'll provide you with some bullet points around each of the answers. Do remember, if you do want to respond to the Transport Select Committee, that the deadline is this Thursday. The TSC's website has all the details. But it has some slightly different questions about whether you think all the information's been provided, whether the evidence is there. So you might want to respond to some of those. Okay. My thanks to Florence for organising, my thanks to Celeste for co-presenting, and thank you to all for joining. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim. That was great.